Okay, so for my next trick, what I'm going to do is show you how to make this really simple stitch right here. I only use one stitch when I am making my sock monsters, and it's this stitch right here. The thing I like about this stitch is that every single stitch is its own independent knot, and it's going to make your life so much easier, I promise. So I'm just going to show you how to make this one stitch. The stitch that most people are already familiar with, if you know how to sew a little bit, or even if you don't, is this stitch right here, which is called a running stitch, which is a very simple over, under, over, under, over, under stitch. And the downfall for this stitch is that once you break one stitch, you can just pull on it and all your stitches come out, just like ping, 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 all the way down the line. So I don't like to use a stitch for making monsters because your socks are so stretchy that they need a really tight dependable stitch. I use this stitch a lot for the running stitch. I use for hemming things. I use it for what's called tacking things together. So in sewing, if you have two pieces of fabric and you want to attach them kind of temporarily before you go in and put your actual stitch in there, that's called tacking. So you can use a running stitch to tack things together. You can use it to hem your pants, but I like to use this other stitch right here for making sock monsters. So the first thing you're going to need is some dark thread and a needle. And what I do is I have all of my students stitch on paper before we move on to fabric. And I just do kind of like a quick informal assessment with them about their stitches. So first thing I'm going to do is cut this thread off and thread a new needle and then tie a giant knot at the end. And if you don't know how to thread a needle, I made a quick video about how to do that before I made this one, so you can go back and check. So I'm going to thread my needle real quick, and then I'm going to tie a giant knot at the end. The big knot's really important, so I'm going to make like a triple knot right here real quick. And the other thing you're going to need is an 8.5 by 11 inch piece of paper. So it doesn't really matter what color your thread is for this. You just want a dark color. A lot of times I have my students use black. So what you're going to do next is take a piece of paper that's an 8.5 by 11 inch piece of paper and just fold it in half like so. And then we're going to be sewing along this open edge right here to attach it together and kind of make a little envelope kind of deal to learn how to do our stitch. The reason I use white paper and dark thread is it's really, really hard to see your stitches when you have red thread and a red fabric. So I want to make sure everybody is making their stitches correctly so their monsters don't fall apart before we even start cutting up socks. So the way this stitch works is you're just going to take your two edges that are open and pretend that they're fabric, and you're going to go front to back like this, front to back, and then you're going to go through the loop, and that makes a knot. So front to back, through the loop, front to back, through the loop. So it doesn't really matter if your stitches look kind of wonky and aren't completely regular. These stitches are going to be on the inside of your sock monster and no one's going to see them. So when your first few stitches look kind of crazy, don't worry about it. Nobody's going to see them. And what's important is that you're going front to back all the way through both pieces of paper or later on fabric, and that you're making this knot where you go through the stitch. That's what makes it really strong. And so I have a lot of students who go home and they've learned how to sew and they come back and they fix their backpack or they fix something else. And so this is a really great kind of stitch for that. Like if you need to hold a strap on a backpack that's full of books, this is a stitch that you can depend on to hold your stuff together. So what I do for my assessment then is I have my students sew along the edges, the open edges of their piece of paper. They're essentially making a little envelope, right? So that way I can see how their stitches look. And it doesn't take very long at all because once you kind of get into the rhythm of making your stitches, you don't even really have to think about it. So you just want to kind of get in a pattern where you go in front to back through the loop. Okay, so that's how you make your very first stitch, the one and only stitch really. You need to make a sock monster. It's the only one I use. So now you are ready to sew your envelope together along the edges. And then the next step is that we're going to start looking at socks and cutting out some shapes. So that is step number 2 of Sock Monsters 101.